On June 6, 2015, a woman in the second floor of her Bronx apartment building heard a noise coming from outside. When she went into her backyard to investigate, she looked up and saw something no mother and no human being should ever have to see. The body of her 22-year-old son, Khalif Browder, was hanging by his neck from a rope he had attached to an air conditioning unit. While the story may seem alarming and shocking at first, a quick glance at Khalif's life story makes it more outrageous. From the ages 16 to 19, he spent 3 years in the Rikers Island jail. 2 of those years he spent in solitary confinement, 23 hours a day, completely alone in an empty cell. He survived countless beatings from his fellow inmates and from prison guards. He survived brawls in jail. He survived previous suicide attempts. And the most shocking fact of all was at Khalif's time of death, he had never been convicted of a crime, and he had never been found guilty in a court of law. Good evening, everybody. My name is Alex Forget, and I'm here today to talk about the utter failure of the American justice system to uphold both the principles of the American Constitution and of justice itself. While the entire justice system of the country with the largest prison population in the world may be difficult to tackle with a 13-minute time limit, today I'll be talking about 2 case studies that I believe perfectly capture this critical failure. The first is that of plea bargaining, and the second is that of involuntary confinement, a process in which those deemed mentally ill can be locked in jail without a trial. These 2 issues violate the 5th Amendment right to not have to self-incriminate, the 6th Amendment right to have a fair trial with access to a judge and a jury, etc., and the 13th Amendment right, while originally written for slavery, that guarantees that you will not be held against your will unless you have been found guilty of a crime. Following that, I'll be talking about why this is relevant to us as Canadians and how we should go about solving it. Ladies and gentlemen, those 3 amendments that I discussed just a moment ago make up the core of the justice system and what is supposed to be the beacon of freedom for the rest of the world. And yet another core of that system, the plea bargain, fundamentally violates all 3 of those amendments. While legal dramas have shown us for years on television that they're arranged to help weak defendants from dangerously long sentences, this couldn't be further from the truth. The reason plea bargains exist is that the United States doesn't have the physical means to provide a courtroom, to provide judges, to provide lawyers to all of the 2 million people who are currently in a United States prison and the 4 million additional people who are on some form of parole or probation. This is why 97% of those people haven't been convicted in court and have instead accepted a deal. It seems obvious that at the rate of 97%, A, some of those people are innocent, and B, not all of them confessed voluntarily. So why did they do it? Let's go back to the story of Khalif Browder. All he was accused of doing was stealing a backpack. One of the deals offered to him involved admitting that he was guilty and going home that day with no time in jail. Because Khalif was innocent, he refused to let his name be slandered, so instead the prosecution team put him in jail, where he awaited a trial for 3 years. At 19 years old, the prosecution was forced to admit that they had no evidence against him, and they let him go. He ended up hanging from his 2nd floor window. In the same way the body of someone who had been lynched did 50 years ago, his body hanged there as a warning to all of those who dare try to exercise their rights. Because people are compelled to confess in the United States. In fact, the vast majority are. And when they try to stand up for their 5th Amendment rights, their other rights are taken instead. In Khalif Browder's case, this ultimately included his right to life. While stories like Khalif Browder's and others of the same nature have slowly gained some mainstream media attention, there is another place, far on the other side of the country, that I'm willing to bet most of us here today have never heard of. I myself hadn't heard of it until I arrived there by chance late this summer. Halfway on the alternate route from San Francisco to Sequoia National Park, after 90 miles of driving through absolutely empty mountainous desert terrain, someone would arrive at Coalinga. Now, Coalinga is a town of about 9,000 people. Founded as a mining town, it was originally named Coaling Station A, but Coalinga's #1 employer is now something much more sinister. Far on the outskirts of town, miles away from any other form of civilization, there's the ironically named Pleasant Valley State Prison. Built for 2,300 people, the prison now contains over 3,500. Shockingly, a prison at 160% capacity isn't even alarming anymore in the American justice system. What I'm focusing on today is the other institution that is next door to Pleasant Valley State Prison, the Coalinga State Hospital, a mental health facility that currently contains over 880 sexual predators. One of these people is Kevin Riley. Kevin Riley could be in no way more different than Khalif Browder. He is a 54-year-old white man who was found guilty in court of molesting 3 separate young girls. One of those girls was his daughter. For his crimes, he was sentenced to 3 years in jail. Some people would argue, perhaps justly, that that sentence was too short. But the problem with his treatment is not the 3 years in which he was in prison. It is what happened next. In 2000, when his sentence was supposed to be over, and when, according to the Constitution and the law, he should have been freed, he was deemed not by a judge, not by a jury, but by a doctor to be a sexual violent predator. He was then transferred to the California Civil Involuntary Confinement process. He was told, as all people are, that he had the basic human right to refuse medical treatment. However, just like Khalif Browder, he was told that if he exercised that right, he would spend the rest of his life in jail. So instead, he opted to begin the so-called the so-called 5-phase program, the only one currently on offer at Coalinga State Prison. This horrific so-called treatment process includes forcing people to write letters to their victims, forcing people to confess to all the crimes they have committed, and most shockingly, forcing people to watch pornography while their sexual responses are measured by a machine. Because of desperation of how horrible this system seems, Kevin Riley in 2003 took a step that isn't recommended but is completely allowed by the state of California and paid for himself to be castrated. It still took him 8 more years to complete the 5-phase program. In 2011, a clinical team of doctors deemed that he was no longer a sexually violent predator. He was still kept for 3 more years. In 2014, a decade and a half after the sentence he was given had been completed, he was finally given a chance in court. And yet still, the state of California sent a team of prosecutors to try to keep him behind bars. The jury disagreed. Kevin Riley was freed, in part to his psychiatrist's testimony that he is the only patient in the history of Coalinga State Prison to ever complete this training program. While it may seem like these two people have nothing in common, there is one key aspect that a young African-American boy in the Bronx and a 54-year-old severely mentally ill man share. They are both the vulnerable in our society. They are both the people who have no one to speak out for them. And a society should not be judged on how it treats its best, and not be judged by how it treats its strongest, but how it treats its most vulnerable and how it treats its worst. The United States failed these two people, but why does that matter to us as Canadians? First of all, as a country that prides itself on human rights, we have the duty to call out these injustices when we see them. We do this often in third world countries with dictatorships on the other side of the world, but we mustn't stop there. We also have a duty to call out the injustices in Western liberal democracies just south of our border. But there is a second issue too, and that is that this problem is contagious. In fact, as I was writing this speech, the Globe and Mail published an editorial about a young First Nations boy in Northern Ontario who has spent 5 years in a solitary confinement plexiglass cell with 24 hours a day simulated sunlight. The United Nations threshold for torture under those conditions is 15 days. Despite never being found guilty of a crime, this boy has been there for 100 times that long by the Canadian government. The world must solve this problem, not just the United States, but if we are ever to achieve change on an international scale, the most powerful country in the world and supposedly the greatest democracy in the history of the world have to be at the lead of that change. So what's causing it and how do we fix it? The main issue here is how political the justice system has become in the United States. For in the state of California, judges are, for the most part, elected, which means the same people administering Kevin Riley's trial would have to run for re-election the next year after just letting a sexual predator back into the community. It's no wonder these people aren't treated fairly. Also in the United States, district attorneys are elected. They run for re-election based off how high their conviction rates are, not by whether they treated people fairly. That's why stories like Khalif Browder's happen far, far too often. So the solution on that aspect is to make the United States adopt a similar system to countries such as Canada, the United Kingdom, and other democracies, where the electoral system has no control over the judicial system. But even beyond that, there's a problem with the way laws are written in the United States. Because of corporate lobbying, we have seen the formation of something called the prison industrial complex, which means prisons in the United States are no longer just a form of rehabilitation, but now a form of generating profit for companies. Companies that own private prisons, companies that provide health services to prisons, and companies such as Aramark, which many people don't know, Aramark's largest client is the United States Correction Services. Those companies have an interest in keeping people behind bars. As a result, organizations such as the American Legal Exchange Council, which pressure lawmakers to make tough on crime legislation, are formed. Another solution that we must have to solve this problem is to make that stop, to reform campaign finance laws and lobbying laws, to make these companies have less control over the laws that govern us from a criminal standpoint. While those two issues are very hard to achieve, it is no longer time to just discuss raising awareness. This is a large-scale problem. It deserves a large-scale solution. And the reason why that is so important is so stories like Kevin Riley's, and more importantly, stories like Khalif Browder's, never happen again. I don't know why Khalif Browder's story spoke to me so much, but I think it was because of his age. He was just 16 years old. He was a year younger than I am now. And yet as I stand here today speaking to you, he stood alone in a 6-by-9 foot windowless cell. By the time of my life, I'll be receiving my undergraduate degree. Well, I've already told you what happened to Khalif Browder. The only noticeable difference between us was the color of our skin. He had never committed a crime. He had never done anything wrong. But while I was given the privilege of my justice system, he had the burden of his. After being released from jail, Khalif Browder finished his high school equivalency degree and started classes at community college before eventually succumbing to PTSD. I've often thought about if I would be able to handle myself the same way under the circumstances, and I don't think I would be able to do so nearly as well. America is supposed to be the land of the free and the home of the brave. Khalif Browder was one of the bravest among us. It's a shame